Welcome this week to the nonprofit news feed, of course, brought to you by Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency. And we are covering, nonprofit news that comes up, and we try to choose topics that are both sort of trending of the moment, but also have a unique nonprofit involvement or tie-in or implication. And I'll just say, seasonally, sadly, this one topic of shootings in America comes up more often than I wish it did. But, today's topic really is about how nonprofits are trying to mobilize in yet another response to a shooting. And honestly, even from when we sent and summarized this email, there was another shooting in Kentucky. And so frankly, we're referencing one, but in another way, we're trying to summarize what's going on at a high level and what nonprofits are doing about it.
Yeah, George, I appreciate that introduction. So to your point, the top story that we do want to talk about today is, of course, the shooting now 2 weeks ago in Nashville, Tennessee, that occurred where 3 children and 3 adults were killed in a live shooter, active gunman situation. And while that tragedy occurred, the main thing we want to focus on for this story is actually the nonprofit and advocacy response, because in some ways, that community has seen a tremendous amount of, yes, political strife, but also really important mobilization and activism from the communities, particularly those within Nashville who are pushing for gun reform, which, according to proponents of gun control legislation, is severely lacking, not just in Tennessee, but across the United States. So last week, student activists from March for Our Lives and Students Demand Action, which is a subsidiary of Everytown for Gun Safety, have been protesting for gun reform and school safety in and around Nashville, as well as Tennessee broadly, following the March 27th shooting. Their protests have intensified after the state's Republican majority voted to expel 2 young representatives of color, Representatives Jones and Pearson. This comes amid a recent Pew Research Center analysis of CDC data, which found that gun deaths among children and teens in the U.S. increased by 50%, from 1,700 approximately in 2019 to nearly 2,600 in 2021. The gun death rate for minors also rose 46%, reaching its highest point since 1999. So in the backdrop of this tragic shooting, the significant mobilization and advocacy around gun reform, we have statistics now that show that children younger than 18 are now, 2021 was the most dangerous year in a long time in terms of gun deaths. The majority of those gun deaths from ages 0 to 18 are, in fact, homicides. That number breaks down when you start dividing that demographic up by race and age. But George, it seems like our children are dying. And even just yesterday, we hear about another mass shooting at a bank in Louisville, Kentucky, where 5 people were shot, 6, including the gunman, died. George, what's the take on this? Gun violence is at top of everyone's mind. We see the same nonprofit and advocacy organizations stepping up to make their voices heard. In this case, it seems particularly young people who are stepping to the stage to make their voices heard in Nashville and Tennessee and around the country. But what should nonprofits take away from this, particularly those advocating for gun reform, which, despite the narrative, this seems like a perennial thing we do every couple months, and we have all of this, and there's no real change. How do you maintain hope if you're an advocacy organization in moments like this?
Well, first, I want to jump in on the fact that Representatives Jones and Pearson were actually reinstated as of April 11th to the Nashville legislature. And, they were called out for protesting, and we've got great organizations like March for Our Lives and Everytown out there trying to figure out ways of getting legislators, elected representatives to wake up, to make this a nonpartisan issue, to frankly not just cut and paste we're so sorry for this tragedy and, the answer is more guns. Like the trend is clear. And frankly, the data from Pew is always helpful. I think this is a big one, just holding up the mirror. And this is why I called to and look to Pew. I wish they had included 2022 data. Perhaps they're still working through those numbers, but reports for 2022 show that in the neighborhood of 6,000 children in the United States were killed or injured. I think there's, some question of breaking that out, but that is still a massive number. And so, the fact that there are more guns in the system as a net result of record-breaking sales throughout the pandemic for guns, like if your thesis is that more guns equals more safety, is like, at what point do we hit that? And if you're looking for just an amazing conversation, you can find Jon Stewart's takedown of a representative talking about like, at what point do we hit peak safety when every American has 20 guns, 40 guns? Like when does safety kick in? And all I can really do when I look at it is say like, hold up the data, keep up the pressure. I liked, how, each time it's not just malaise setting in, but that's kind of like what you're fighting. These numbers are going up at a drastic rate. And so hopefully nonprofits are able to take this information and bring it to voters. We're coming into an election cycle, bring it to voters and say, I know you love trying to restrict who can go to your freaking bathroom. I know you love that. I know you can't wait to stop people from competing on sports teams, but it's pretty hard to compete when you're being shot at. I think if more people can get in line with the prioritization on left and right politic, I think nonprofits can pull to that. And I also think it's not just sitting on the shoulders of March for Our Lives and Everytown for gun safety. I think other nonprofits can use this to frankly put in perspective how politicians are using and misusing political narratives to draw your attention away from critical issues, saying, this elected official, for example, just going after, trying to remove, let's say, racial history from our education. How about trying to remove bullets from our classrooms? Our politicians are here talking about this. So I think what I'm hoping is that in narratives, more nonprofits beyond just the causes are able to use this in juxtaposition to say, look at what sideshow is going on here to distract people in social impact from the main causes of what needs to be done. So I'm hoping, because that's the energy I choose toward, that this narrative gets adopted by more folks. It is backed by data. I love what Pew is doing. I love what other groups are doing.
Yeah, George, I think that's right. I will say, for better or for worse, the whole debacle around the expulsion of these representatives has made what was kind of a regional story a national story. And it has, in addition to these terrible shootings, positioned gun reform at the top of the national debate yet again. And I think we can hope that the more times that this happens, the national conversation begins to shift even more. And as nonprofit advocacy organizations, taking advantage of that momentum in the moment is really important. We talk about this all the time. If you are advocating for safer communities or gun reform or gun legislation, whatever type of policy intervention that your organization may be promoting that even relates not even just to gun safety, but even to the safety of children, any sort of topic, right? This impacts your communities, and this could be an opportunity to center this debate amongst your nonprofit constituents. So something to think about moving forward, without a doubt.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Absolutely. I'll take us into our next story. And this one comes from Fierce Biotech. And it is that the lauders of
Estee Lauder. Yeah. Estee Lauder.
The lauders of Estee Lauder fame have given a $200 million donation to the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, ADDF, which since 1998 has invested $253 million into its Alzheimer's portfolio. So the ADDF, for 25 years ago, in honor of cosmetic business tycoon Estee Lauder, and received this money from the Lauder family, the nonprofit's largest donation ever. And it will go towards accelerating the development of next-gen drugs that the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation has in its pipeline. And it was, interestingly enough, founded on a venture philanthropy model in 1998, and has invested its portfolio via grants and investments for new Alzheimer's drugs, biomarkers, and prevention programs, among other projects. George, we don't often, there's lots of, high value donations that we see come through our pipeline and in our feeds and all of that. We don't often highlight them. This is an instance where we did. Why is this donation so important, and what should our listeners take away?
I think the large donation toward a singular cause like Alzheimer's research is one of note. I think there's also going to be an increasing amount of philanthropic attention spent on how we're supporting the largest generation in American history reaching, the retirement age, but also age of vulnerability for these types of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. I also like their venture approach, where we're talking about working with drug markets and companies to subsidize the research, the risk associated with bringing a drug to market. I think is very interesting and also effective. One that I know has been championed by the Michael J. Fox Foundation as well in their pursuit to cure, ideally, but manage, Parkinson's. And this approach is interesting to dig into, especially if you're in the medical nonprofit grant making world, because they are able to leverage their dollar 1 to 10x, because they are working with drug companies and providers that are in that research phase, saying like, hey, we're not just going to go alone. We're going to try to help accelerate a drug to market, which is incredibly expensive.
I believe it. No, I think that's a great summation and something to continue to follow when it comes to this type of model. And we've talked about the nonprofit angles when it comes to the rollout of pharmaceuticals before, and the potential benefit. I think the state of California has publicly invested in drugs. I think it was insulin we were talking about just a couple of weeks ago. So we'll continue to follow the nature of philanthropy related to the pharmaceutical and medicinal world. But I can take us to our next story, and this one comes from WTOP. And the title of this story is that Americans know very little about charities, according to a new poll. So the story says that the first comprehensive poll to measure public attitudes on foundations and nonprofits shows that, yes, charities are more trusted than other institutions such as business, governments, and news media, but it shows warning signs for nonprofits, including that only 48% of Only 48% of people think that nonprofits are on the right track. Only a third believe that charities contribute a lot to society, and only 5% of Americans believe or think they or someone in their immediate family has been helped by a nonprofit, even though 1 in 11 work for a charitable organization. So, George, a lot to unpack here. It seems that Americans trust nonprofits in theory, but when it comes to are nonprofits actually helping, the data is a little bit more worrisome. What's our takeaway in this? Is this a societal shift? Is this bad marketing? What's going on here?
I think I reasonably look toward Edelman's annual trust survey to like benchmark it. And so in one sense, I always look and say like, look, out of context, if you just look at the nonprofit industry, you're like, oh no, it's dropping. But if, frankly, our trust in overall institutions has flagged, then that goes from companies to government to also, of course, nonprofits. So, I think this probably mirrors an overall decline in net trust in organized institutions of power. But I think it is even more important to sort of understand how this might overlap with your audience or people that are fence sitters, how you might overcome some of these objections, more nuanced in your donation pages, your appeals, your even welcome series to new donors of how you can look at this data saying, what is it that they're not trusting? What is it about our industry that has the seeds of mistrust? And how do we deal with that and unpack that up front? Because I think this is a hidden hurdle maybe in conversion rates for new donors and maybe even recurring, right? Where you have that single donor coming back only, 20, 30% of the time based on the source where they came from. So I like snapshots like these. I'm always skeptical of the survey, the sample size, and what you're taking away. But I think there's some useful things in here. So if your fundraising team is listening, you can send this their way and ask how you are potentially creating rebuttals to the trust narrative.
George, I think that is a healthy analysis. They've given a lot for our listeners to chew on, but I absolutely agree. And this is something I think we think about a lot when we try to contextualize trust in American institutions, not just within the sector, but across of the sectors. So thanks for doing that for us. All right. I can take us into our next story. And this one comes from ProPublica, the independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit investigative news outlet formed in 2008. And the title of this one is that Clarence Thomas secretly accepted luxury trips from a major GOP donor. So Clarence Thomas, the famously conservative justice on the Supreme Court, has for decades been receiving numerous benefits, shall we say, from his acquaintance with people, I'd say wealthy people of certain political and monetary influence, particularly in the GOP world. So this article particularly talks about how Justice Thomas, as well as his conservative activist wife, Ginny Thomas, particularly seem to fly around the world with this GOP mega donor, Harlan Crow. Thomas has, from Mr. Crow, gone on excursions on a 162-foot mega yacht on trips that are estimated to cost upwards of $500,000. Thomas himself makes $285,000, but has vacationed on Crow's super yacht around the globe, flown on Harlan Crow's private Bombardier Global 5000 jet, has gone with Crow to the Bohemian Grove, the exclusive California All-Mare Retreat, Crow's sprawling ranch in East Texas, and Thomas typically spends about every week, every summer, or 1 week every summer at Crow's private resort in the Adirondacks. The article suggests that his failures to report the flights appear to violate a law passed after Watergate. That, of course, is left up to interpretation. Either way, not a great look. And of particular interest to this podcast is I want to highlight that The quote here is, during just one trip in July 2017, Thomas's fellow guests included executives at Verizon and PricewaterhouseCoopers, major Republican donors, and one of the leaders of the American Enterprise Institute, pro-business conservative think tank, according to records reviewed by ProPublica. The painting of Thomas at Topbridge, where he was, shows him in conversation with Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society leader regarded as an architect of the Supreme Court's recent turn to the right. George, I don't know about you, but there is no chance that Justice Thomas is talking to Leonard Leo, the president of the Federalist Society, about anything involving the courts or policy or law. They're just friends, right? I joke. Joking aside, this is a pretty egregious abuse of power, in my opinion. Corruption, was it illegal for not disclosing it? Maybe. Nothing will probably happen. Nothing ever does happen. But either way, I think it speaks to the inappropriate coziness of public servants with, quite frankly, wealthy operators seeking to influence our public institutions, including Leonard Leo, particularly of the Federalist Society, who we talked about on this podcast, who has started multiple extremely large size dark money 501c4 organizations that shuffle millions of dollars around the right wing conservative legal world. George, I don't really have a nonprofit take other than rich people trying to influence the court, and it looks like they're doing it.
Yeah, you were saying, joking before we turned on recording, like you wanted an excuse to talk about this, and ProPublica is a nonprofit covering it. I would say this is something that is important actually from a nonprofit perspective because, as you are aware, Supreme Court justices are elected for life. And there has been a long time pull by certain nonprofit organizations to install conservative judges. And it seems as though it's not just to install them, but also to keep them voting conservative. And that incentive aligns with these lavish vacations. And it really just comes down to money, power, time, and influence. And frankly, if I know that my annual super yacht vacation will probably happen, but it might be happening more likely if I vote certain consistent ways versus breaking ties. There is an undeniable link and it should be absolutely examined. I was actually looking at a different sort of parallel but hold on, to come back to the nonprofit angle in the lobbying sense. And you're like, oh, we can't lobby Supreme Court justices because that's decision. Like, okay, well, maybe hypothetically, you could have a vacation fund set up for putting, I don't know, vacation rights for anybody who's interested in voting a certain way in abortion. Like, is this opening a door to lobbying? I'm saying like, oh, here's your annual vacation as long as you vote this way. Here's your, we'll become your friend. I'm the CEO I happen to be a CEO of a nonprofit. I'm your friend. Would you like to go on a vacation to, I don't know, wherever you'd like to go, all expense paid, and we'll fundraise for that? Is this a door to lobbying and influence? And I don't think I can say no that quickly. So I think to me, this opens up a problem and exposes an issue. And also the juxtaposition here is that if you want something interesting of like, oh, it's just, if you're of the mindset, like, this is just a, friends and a paid vacation and they just happen to be that way. Look at the NCAA recruiting rules for athletes to colleges. Like I went through this process. I was actually went to a Division I school and I remember being like, you have to get here on your own. You get a per diem of $35. They cannot give you any gift above $50. And God help me, if I had been taken to some sort of trip or something else, I would have been ineligible. Here's what I would have to say. How can the rule for athletes with no freaking money being moved into college have greater scrutiny than the U.S. Supreme Court? Question.
George, that's a very good question. And I wish there
NCAA,
was an
also a
obvious answer.
nonprofit, also different rant for a different day, makes more money than any other major sports league.
Yes, that is a
It's
different.
easier. You know what? It's easier when you don't pay your employees, your athletes, your competitors. It's easier.
Boom, just image and likeness. That's a whole. We should do a sports podcast.
We did do a little bit on that. I want to be actually. Hold on, I'm being a little unfair to the NCAA. They do amazing. We'll wait for the moment. I'm being unfair to the NCAA. Actually, I'll say.
We'll get there. Yeah, but George, to your point, it's unacceptable. I'll also say this is an egregious abuse of power. That being said, I would not place money that the other Supreme Court justices are saints either, right? Especially over the past 30 years. So lest we think that we're trying to gang up on Thomas, this is of course egregious. Doubtful the others have a perfect record either. But to your point, can our institutions withstand money influence? And we need to do, if the past 6 years have taught us anything, it's that we, as a society, as nonprofits, a lot of those dark money institutions are nonprofits. We need to reevaluate our relationship with public service, public policy, and lobbying is a thing. You lobby for bills. Lobbying is really, really important. But the extent to which some organizations are able to infiltrate the highest levels of power, the Supreme Court, which essentially has the unilateral power to do most anything, that opens up a lot of questions. And we'll continue to ask those questions, but maybe a good place to start for right now.
Well, we had some solid rants today, a little longer than usual. Pretty happy with it, but I do have an important question for you, Nick.
Oh, no.
How exactly do you measure the weighted impact of a nonprofit's social media influence?
The weighted impact? Do not know.
Instagrams.
Right.
Well, that's what you get for making it to the end. Leave a rating or review if you feel like it. If not, that's fine too. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, George.